Well, good morning. My name is Matt, and I am one of the co-pastors here. And I was about 40 years old back in 2006. It was about 16 years ago when we first did a series like the one that we're in this week, or this month rather, called Stogies and Stilettos. That was the title. That was the way that we marketed it. That was over a decade ago. And about 10 years ago, or about 10 years into it actually, something started to take place. We started to understand relationships and sexuality in a different way. Our understanding of that began to transition, and there came a point where we realized that titling it's a little bit too binary, too rigid to sort of encompass what we were experiencing as a community. And it's gone through several iterations, but that's how we wound up with this topic or this entitlement for this series called Queen of Hearts. And so I know there's quite a few new people here this morning, or maybe you've only been hanging out Watershed for, I don't know, a few months or the last year. I thought that might be some context that would be worth hearing. We've been doing this particular series for a long time. There's also something that is a little bit more trivial, but again, it might be worth mentioning. Up until just a few years ago, every time we would prepare for this series, we would designate one weekend as sort of the, quote, sex talk. Like that's the weekend we were going to try to articulate God's ideal view of sex, who should be having sex, who shouldn't be, when they're having sex. And for reasons that I still don't fully understand, every year when that talk was scheduled, I was the go-to pastor for those talks. The fact that you chuckle around that creates all sorts of security for me, so thank you there. But, you know, it makes sense, right? If you really want to know how God really feels about sex, clearly a straight, white, cisgendered, middle-aged husband with 3 kids recovering from evangelical purity culture is your most reliable source, bar none. All right, what could go wrong in 14 straight years of this? And it is a miracle that anything has changed, to be quite frank. But at the risk of a little bit of a letdown, I want you to know this year, I'm not doing the sex talk. I know. I can hear the disappointment in your voice there. But I think the good news is because we have such a much broader spectrum of voices here at Watershed, instead of just a couple dudes that talk a lot, we've got a spectrum of so many different amazing people that talk here on a particular weekend. The conversation around anything having to do with relationships, sex, sexuality, that's going to be handled in a more diverse and I would argue profound way. This morning, and this being the first weekend of the series, there's something that's kind of been germinating for me for about a year now, and I want to try to lean into it a little bit. It's still being formed, I think, in some ways, but I've been drawn back to this particular story in Luke's Gospel in chapter 10. And this story kind of helps unearth where I want to go this morning. It's the story, maybe you're familiar with it. It's an exchange between Jesus and 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, arguably outside of Jesus' mother, the 2 most important women of his life. And Luke writes, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, Jesus answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Now, I don't know if you grew up in church and kind of heard this story described or interpreted, but as I was growing up in my evangelical tradition, there was a lot of emphasis placed on spending what was called quiet time with God, with Jesus, who were synonymous, reading the Bible, praying, doing devotionals, personal worship, so to speak. And In a word, sitting at the feet of Jesus. That was an actual phrase, a thing that would be talked about. And sitting at the feet of Jesus was synonymous to sitting at the feet of God. And so this story of Martha and Mary was often used to underscore kind of the right way of doing things and the not so right way of doing things, the wrong way. And so Martha, distracted by the things of this world, was an example of misdirection or failure when it came to her focus or attention towards God. And then Mary, like physically, literally sitting at the feet of Jesus / God, she was the model of success. She was the real mature Christian, so to speak. And again, if the divinity of Jesus is the central focal point here, then no harm, no foul, right? Like that sort of kind of makes sense. But the problem is that Jesus was also fully human, right? Like he was a flesh and blood person. And in the story, when you dislocate him from that human experience, there's things that you might miss. I mean, this is Jesus having a human moment with two friends. And this raises, I think, a much different question than who worshiped better, who did it better, who worshiped correctly, to what causes this one sister to be so hyper-focused on performance versus presence. The presence we at least appear to observe in Mary. What is it that's encoded in Martha that in her economy, in this moment, production is the best use, as she sees it, of her time and her energy? I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about, like, what could have been the bass note underneath what was going on for Martha. And, at first I was like, well, maybe it's sibling rivalry, right? Like I've got kids and there's a lot of competition there. And I've got one kid who happens to be older than the others, who seems to show up in like get it done ways, more responsible ways that often are mythological in our culture. Like I think sometimes we assume that just because a sibling is older, they're more responsible than a younger. All my kids are responsible in various fashions, and all of them are irresponsible in various fashions, right? So it's not sort of this binary way of seeing sisters or brothers and sisters. And one thing I would want to say too is, like, people who really get things done, or people who are really prone to be like present in various circumstances, both are huge strengths of the world. So I'm not trying to undermine either one of those, but maybe it had something to do with some sort of sibling rivalry. Maybe it had something to do with patriarchy or sexism, right? Like Jesus was a man. Jesus held a particular degree of authority and power in that day and age, and there was no shortage of either in that day and age. But the point is, there was something, right? Something underneath the thing here that was driving Mary. And it wasn't the end of the world, but she kind of missed out a little bit. To hear Jesus describe it, Martha missed out. Mary experienced something that was irrevocable. There was something that happened for her in that moment that was always going to stay with her moving forward. Recently, I've been reflecting back on my life and trying to become aware of all the different emotional expressions of myself, especially early on in my life as it pertains to the pursuit of another person, to date, to marry, the pursuit of sleeping with other people, because I was 17 years old. I was a college student. I went through all of those phases. But if I had an emotional ledger of sort, and I could have recorded all the things I was feeling throughout that part of my life, I would have as line items for myself things like sadness in the midst of loneliness, disappointment in the expression of attraction and that not being reciprocated, fear and stress of realizing I need to end a relationship when I realize I'm going to have to do that. Grief or brokenheartedness when I'm rejected or after someone ends it with me, which happens, right? Happened to me. The joy, kind of in the positive side of the ledger, potentially, the joy or ecstasy during a honeymoon phase of the relationship, the luster of that new feeling. felt safety and support during many of these relationships, because there was always a season where you felt like everything was firing. And certainly that's been something I've experienced in my life with Donna. But those would be some of the line items in my emotional ledger. And I hope what you're doing right now is maybe reflecting back and going, oh, wow, like maybe I have a ledger too. And if you had to kind of, for yourself, think about some of the line items in your emotional ledger throughout your life, what would they look like? Would they look like something that maybe I named back then, or maybe even you're showing up that way today? But I'll be 56 years old tomorrow. Thank you. That was weak, but okay. I'll be 50. Tomorrow is my birthday, and thank you for not being so excited, I suppose. I actually know what you're thinking, though. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, where should I send Matt's gifts? That's what you're thinking right now, and I want you to know that I don't expect any gifts from you, all right? Your support, your validation is enough to actually stand up and even mention my birthday. That's superficial. I would never want you to think I'm anything but other than forthright and all that. But I'll be 56, and I've noticed that the line items in my ledger these days are different. They're much different. For instance, I harbor guilt sometimes when I rest. My self-worth is way too wrapped up in my performance here at Watershed. I battle fear around being financially prepared for a season when I'm no longer able to work. I sometimes prioritize productivity over my own mental or emotional health. I get confused and think that working harder is somehow the path to happiness. Sometimes I can't help but have this sort of negative disposition about being lazy, regardless of how much pain or trauma or adversity that I'm experiencing. Busyness is a way that I avoid the needs of myself and the needs of others. I harbor embarrassment or resentment because of professional failures, past and present. And when I say past, I mean sometimes like decades back. Now, it's important to point out that this isn't happening 24/7, right? Like I'm not drenched in all of these feelings all of the time, but they are buried there beneath the soil of my operational self. They're sort of quietly undermining who I am, sometimes subversively informing the way that I show up in the world with the people that I'm with here on staff or my friends or in my professional realms, also with my kids, and certainly as it pertains to Donna, as a husband, as a life partner, as a co-parent, as a lover. That's as far as it's going to go in the sex talk right there. That's it. That's as far as it goes. And thank God she's not here this morning. It's like the people I'm most intimate with bear the brunt of all of what informs me and us, right? By the way, it's interesting. According to developmental theorists and sociologists, line items such as the one that I just referenced are symptomatic of something called internalized capitalism. I don't think anybody would dispute that we live in an overtly capitalistic society, and at the risk of stating the obvious, capitalism is defined as an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. Capitalism prioritizes growth, profits, and the discovery of new markets within a free market society. These priorities or bottom lines are built into the fabric of the way that we view the world. They are the scorecards, so to speak, for success and accumulation of wealth and power. And that's kind of stating the obvious. And as a side note, I want you to know this isn't a critique this morning about capitalism as an economic system. I do think it's worth mentioning, though, that there's an ocean full of research and academia that supports the notion of how capitalism and white supremacy are spectacular bedfellows. And so I want to make sure that I mention that, but a critique of that nature, maybe some other day. It's also worth mentioning that while that's not worth critiquing, it is worth critiquing how the frenetic pace, the pursuit of success and wealth and power and greed, and our assimilation into that, that systemic way the world works, how that affects the way that we think about ourselves and the relationships we have. And so I want to take a few minutes this morning and draw some observations and hopefully maybe a couple of applications at the end. Here's the first thing I think that's worth observing. Capitalism as it romanticizes bootstrap mentality or meritocracy. Capitalism carries with it the belief that it inspires innovation, creativity, and hard work. And I don't think there's anything to argue there. It believes that the meritorious will eventually win the prize, and in doing so will eventually get the life or win the life that they desire because they've earned it. And if you don't get that life, it's because you weren't enough, you didn't have what it takes, you lacked a certain degree of character or intellect or grit. And again, some partial truth there, but it's important to note that historically speaking, there have been systems that have disproportionately favored some groups over other groups, actually in some instances working against other groups. And again, more on that some other day, but the point being is that capitalism reinforces the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, i.e. meritocracy. It also validates transactional relationships. In a free market society, competition, survival of the fittest is sort of the natural selection process for success and wealth. And so relationships that exist within that system are assigned value based on that relationship's ability to provide gains. In other words, if I can monetize the relationship, if I can view the relationship as worth having, then great. But if it ceases to be profitable, if at some point, the investment, the return on the investment is not enough, well, then it needs to end. And it's not personal, it's just business, right? Nod to Michael Corleone in The Godfather. And by the way, social media platforms fully leverage everything that I'm describing here through algorithms and advertisement and marketing, dating, or hookup platforms literally monetize even the pursuit or the desire to have relationships. And it has nothing to do with creating a better universe or valuing human life or human flourishing. Instead, it's a way of generating wealth and capitalizing on the longing or the desires of people as they decide who's in and who's out. Swipe left, swipe right. Decide if this person, just based on their picture or profile, is worth my time, investing my time or not. Meritocracy, transactional relationship. Capitalism dehumanizes. I'm going to invest in a relationship. I'm going to capitalize on my time with this person. Now that it's over, I'm going to put myself back on the market. Our marriage isn't worth it, or this relationship isn't worth it anymore. There's too low of an ROI. These are all phrases that could just as easily describe acquiring, investing, or selling a particular stock, a property, or a business. And simply put, in relationships where we should be seeking to see the humanity in each other the most, instead we're often conditioned towards vocabulary of the larger market in which we exist. I think capitalism, and this, I want to spend some time on this one. This one I think is the most important. Capitalism dismisses suffering. Here's what I mean by that. Unless it's suffering as part of a natural selection process of the survival of the fittest, unless it's marked as the necessary step to a process towards success, in capitalism as a belief, suffering really holds no value. In fact, if you're suffering, it's probably because you did that to yourself. If you're suffering, if you failed, it's probably your own fault. You're on your own there. We really don't see a need to come around you. And so it's dismissed by the system itself. But in capitalism, there's also this kind of subversive notion that it's dismissed by God. There's an author, the guy's name is Eugene McCarrier, and he wrote a book called The Enchantments of Mammon, How Capitalism Became the Religion of Modernity. I haven't read the book, to be transparent, but he writes this in an article. He says, where the Abrahamic religions had imagined men and women in the image and likeness of God, neoliberalism, capitalism, sees entrepreneurial selves cast in the image and the likeness of the market. It's the morrow of neoliberal, i.e. capitalism, as divinity. And far from merely allocating goods and resources, the market is the ontological architecture of the universe, an inerrant, universal quintessence wiser than any errant human being. Now, seeing the market as somehow divine or ontological is not new, certainly not in American history. From Puritans to Mormons to contemporary evangelicals, Protestants, and especially after World War II, Catholics have long believed that success in the capitalistic marketplace is a sign of providential blessing. And to kind of summarize, within capitalism, there's this base note kind of under the surface belief that says growth and profits equals God's blessings. Suffering and failure, God's withholding of God's blessing. And I would surmise that's not just a misinformed way of understanding the universe, but it's also a mythical and myopic way of trying to make sense of a universal force that is beyond our capacity to understand or name, beyond our capacity to kind of box in. And I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth in a moment, so hang on there. I don't understand. I literally thought God orchestrated this relationship between us. How could it have gone so wrong when it felt so right? I thought I heard God speak when it came to this other person. Why is God doing this to me or us? Why is God punishing me? These are questions that for my entire pastoral experience have been sent my way when someone is lamenting over financial failure or any sort of failure, any sort of suffering, not the least of which is often relational suffering. And there's more than one reason that I think this question gets asked, but part of why we frame the question this way has something to do with the way capitalism responds to suffering. You're not enough. God is distancing himself from you. And so why would God do this? And that just doesn't square with a suffering Jesus. None of it. A Jesus who on the cross identifies with our suffering, validates, redeems in the resurrection story of himself, not because of any sort of goodness, but because of God's goodness. But internalized capitalism will suggest something different. It tells a different story. Clearly, you didn't work hard enough. You should have been able to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps here. Every relationship is a transaction. It's a means to an end. And it will, in some instances, keep you in a relationship that's unhealthy. And in some instances, it will having you hit the eject button too quickly because, oh my gosh, suffering must mean that God has removed his blessing. Jesus once prayed. He said, Father, I have given them your word. I do not ask you take them out of the world, but to keep them from the evil one. And the evil one is sort of this metaphor of, out of control authorities and powers and systemic injustices within Jesus' world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but to keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. And Jesus understood that apart from some sort of physical death, there was this reality in which we lived that was impossible to escape. It was always going to kind of be there, and there's no way to change it so that it became fully everything that God longed for. But he would often pray or often move towards God in a way that says, develop the capacity for my people, for anyone who has ears to hear and eyes to see, the capacity to live in the world and not be of the world, to live as though a different world is possible in our lifetime. But how do you do that? How are you to be in but not of? How does a fish become self-aware that the fish is wet? Right? Because that's kind of what we're talking about here. We live in this world and we swim in particular realities. We're like a fish in water that sometimes doesn't realize we're wet. Well, what do you do if you realize you're wet and you want to try to escape that at some level or live well in it? And I would offer that resistance is a form of trying to live well in the world but not be of the world. And so in terms of how we navigate marriage and dating and being by ourselves or singleness or sexual expression, what do we do? How do we show up in a resistant fashion? And I'm just going to talk about two, and they're very brief. The first one is community as resistance. Community is where we get to practice resisting the isms that dehumanize ourselves and others. It's in the way that we make room for the experiences of people who are not like ourselves. It's in the way that we practice hospitality and empathy that this happens. It's in the way that we recenter power and conversations away from the status quo of power and to the margins. It's in doing this. As we do this, there's a humanity that we begin to experience and notice in each other's lives that consistently goes undermined, unnoticed, or dismissed in the systems of this world. The only reason that this series has a different title and that we have 6 different voices now is because of this type of reality. It's as a community resisting what often goes on in the world and allowing that to change us. I'd say this too. Whenever this series has been transformative for someone, I don't think it's because there's been some indisputable, inerrant, all-wise dispensation from a morally or theologically superior teacher on stage. I don't think that at all. Instead, I think it's through the ongoing process of relationship in this community. Growth, transformation happens in a death and resurrection ongoing process. It's not a one-time event to be saved. You're constantly being saved. And community, practicing a type of community that holds space for that to unfold, space for that to be replicated, to go against the grain of bottom line thinking. Bottom line thinking that says, oh, it's too long, it's too difficult, it's too cumbersome, it's too inefficient. And so being here, I'm glad I'm saying this the first Sunday of the year. Being here, putting yourself out there regardless of what your relational status or situation might be. It might feel dangerous. It might even feel disappointing or inconsequential at times, and it certainly would be messy, but make no mistake, that is community, and that's a type of resistance. Community as resistance. And then this last thing, and I'm still working this idea out in my head a bit, so bear with me, but imagination as resistance. Love of neighbor as self, and human flourishing as an end all. That's irrational in a capitalistic view. Yet, love invites us to be nonsensical, right? It's not the way of the world. It invites us to imagine a different way with each other. This is a picture of my mom and dad on their 51st wedding anniversary. It's a family treasure of sorts these days. It was before all these things started to happen to my family, before the suffering, before the political conflict, before the pandemic, and before my dad's health started to decline. And it wasn't too long after this particular day that my dad's illness started to really take charge of his life. He could no longer venture very far from his house, if at all. He couldn't make trips to Charlotte to see my kids play in their sporting events or my kids graduate from high school. And eventually, his suffering and my mom's suffering alongside of him began to find more energy. It left him struggling to breathe, confined at first to a recliner and then eventually to a hospital bed for the remaining years and months and weeks and hours of his life. For my mom and dad, there would be no more vacations, no more new mountains to scale or businesses or ministries to start. And for 3 years, their collective life was lived, quarantined really, in the square footage of about 1,300 square feet. My parents' life together for 50 plus years wasn't it wasn't always kicks and giggles. There was often marital strife. When I was in college and in high school, separation, a near divorce in their 50s, financial struggles, failed businesses, personal challenges. But something unexpected happened, something beyond what is normal by the way our world works. The suffering through the last 3 years together began to strip them of so much of what the world had always insisted was important. And what began to happen was they started to reimagine what it meant just to be together, what it meant to be emotionally and physically supportive or present to each other in a much more limited situation. I've heard it said that fatigue makes cowards of us all. I remember that used to be something that was in a locker room when I was growing up as an athlete. But in my parents' situation, fatigue didn't create a cowardice. Instead, out of it emerged courage and resilience, and out of suffering emerged joy. Their happiness stopped depending on the things that relationships are often told are necessary. Instead, there was simplicity. There was a tenderness that both my parents began to embody for and with each other. What was once trivial experiences or moments all of a sudden started to be like sacred. They would spend hours together doing absolutely nothing. Hand-holding became sacred. The small inside jokes became sacred. My mom caring for my dad's needs, even the most basic need, became sacred. My mom, there was one instance where I went to Kentucky and she said, here, she handed me this like really beautiful metal tray with china and silverware and this red cloth napkin and a china cup of coffee. And she said, here, this is your dad's lunch, take that to him. And I'm like, man, this is really nice. And she said, we've never used styrofoam or plastic forks in this house. And she said, I want your dad to have as many normal, nice things as possible that reminds him that he's still here and that he still matters. In their earlier years, my dad could be hypercritical. They could both be hypercritical of each other, but in those last few years, they chose gratitude over bitterness. And my mom became my dad's greatest hero in his eyes. And there wasn't a visit that I would experience where he didn't go out of his way to remind me of how beautiful she was and how courageous. And she is working so hard. She works so hard, Matt, he would say to me. The last 2 years with your dad were the most intimate 2 years, or excuse me, 3 years than all of the decades combined. And this is what my mom would say about my dad each time I would show up. And why am I telling you this story? It's both tragic and inspiring that suffering, it takes suffering to produce that type of imagination. I'm telling you this because I think it paints a picture of what's possible in the way that we're conditioned to prioritize our ideas and our lives when that starts to be dismantled. I'm telling you this because it doesn't have to be that way at all. When we let go or we defect from the expectations that are placed on us in the world, when we allow our imaginations to transcend the status quo offerings of this world, that form of transcendence, I think, invites us to see and feel God in God's self. I think it's here. And this is where I start talking out of both sides of my mouth. I think it's here where we begin to bump into God. I think this is where God often works, not at exploding profit margins, but in this hard, complicated, troubling, counterintuitive realities in the person that's right in front of you, even if that person happens to be in the mirror in whatever situation you find yourself in. But will you and will we allow our imaginations to take us someplace different? Resistance in the form of community, resistance through imagination. God, this morning as we step into 2022, it makes sense how decimated our imaginations might be in the fatigue and the grief and the fear and all of the emotions that have been added onto our emotional ledger because of the world that we live in today. But for the next several weekends, we're going to be talking about some of the most intimate human realities of our individual selves, our relationships, our failed relationships, our victorious relationships, our sexuality, intimacy, like everything in between. And God, if we can't move through this in community, and if we can't start to have an imagination that is kissed more by the divine than a market system, we are screwed. We're screwed. And so God, may we hold on to each other. May we make room for the transcendent. And God, may we live defiantly in resistance to those things in the world that would have us believing anything else. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.